Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and today, listeners, I have a wonderful themed episode for you, counting down the top 10 teenagers of Agatha Christie with guest co-host Troy Hunter, who is himself a YA author. You will learn all about Troy and the teenagers he selected in just a few moments. I have a few preliminaries to get through first. As I have mentioned once or twice, my third ghostwriter mystery titled Sweet Spot, which is a locked room mystery set in the American Southwestern Desert, that book is now out. It has been released. It has been unleashed onto the world, and I'm very excited about that. And I have a few book events here in the United States I just want to make sure everyone knows about. I already let you know about my upcoming tour in New England, which is the week of July 13th, where I will be in Plainville, Massachusetts, Wakefield, Rhode Island, Avon, Connecticut, Provincetown, Massachusetts, and East Sandwich, Massachusetts. That is all taking place within 4 days from Monday, July 13th through Thursday, July 16th. So if you are in the area, please come join me. I will also be in New York City, in Manhattan at the Mysterious Bookshop on Tuesday, July 28th. I'm going to be in conversation with Jackie McMahon, who wrote a fantastic period mystery called The Cloak and Dagger Club. I actually blurbed this book for Jackie, and it's set in London, 1930. It is oh so very golden age. It's a lot of fun. So we will be discussing lots of Agatha Christie-ish things at the Mysterious Bookshop, and I'm hoping that a number of you will be able to get to that event in the New York area. So please don't be shy. Come see me there. Again, Tuesday, July 28th at 6 p.m. at the Mysterious Bookshop, a wonderful bookshop owned by Otto Penzler, which is just a delight for all mystery fans. And then in August, I'm embarking on a tour in the Midwest and Western region of the United States. So real briefly, I will be visiting bookstores in Chicago, Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Houston, Texas, Scottsdale, Arizona, and Salt Lake City, Utah. I may also be visiting a bookstore in Denver, Colorado. That one is still in the works, though, so it's not confirmed. You can check the news and events page on my website, which I have linked to in the show notes for details about all of this, and I will keep that page updated as things develop. But I will be visiting all of those cities. Those are, for the most part, cities that I have never visited before. So I'm really looking forward to meeting some new folks out there in these cities in the Midwest and West. Two of those events will also be in conversation. I will be sitting down with Lena Churn in Chicago. And then in Salt Lake City, I will be sitting down with Marcy K. Monson, who I interviewed on this podcast. She has put out 2 children's picture book versions of Agatha Christie novels, The Mysterious Affair at Styles and The Mystery of the Blue Train. And she has moved on to Nancy Drew now. She is giving the children's picture book treatment to a few classic Nancy Drew titles. So can't wait to speak with her in Salt Lake City. And it was really special to me to be able to visit that state, since that is the state in which most of Sweet Spot takes place. So I'm really excited to be doing all of this touring. Thank you for bearing with me as I go through these preambles. I know for many of you around the globe, this is irrelevant chatter, but I just want to make sure that those of you who can see me are able to, and to give you all the information, and just encourage you to come out there and see me. So again, click on the link in the show notes. Reach out to me via email if you have any questions, allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And I hope to see you soon. Okay, I have a few spoiler warnings to run through for my conversation with Troy, as is the case in these themed episodes where we really get into the titles that we discuss. There are a lot of spoilers, so just know that the following titles are spoiled in this episode: At Bertram's Hotel, The Body in the Library, A Caribbean Mystery, Cat Among the Pigeons, Crooked House, Evil Under the Sun, Five Little Pigs, Halloween Party, Nemesis, Sparkling Cyanide, Spider's Web, and Third Girl. And with that, my preamble is done. Let's just get right to my conversation with Troy because it's a really great one. Here goes. I am super pleased to have Troy Hunter on the podcast today. Troy is an adult and YA crime fiction writer who lives in Australia, as you will be able to tell in just a second once he starts speaking. He works as a marketing and communications consultant at the University of Melbourne. His wonderful debut YA crime novel, Gus and the Missing Boy, was published in March 2024 and was shortlisted for the Ned Kelly Best Debut Crime Fiction Award and the Bad Sydney Danger Best Debut Crime Fiction Award. Just for a little context, these are the two big crime writing awards in Australia, and having a YA book shortlisted alongside the adult books is quite a big thing. The sequel to Gus and the Missing Boy, which is titled Gus and the Burning Stones, was published in August of 2025. Troy regularly appears at writers' festivals, and he presented at the 2025 Agatha Christie Festival in the UK, where I was lucky enough to finally meet him in person. He spoke there about the portrayal of teens in Christie, and if you missed his talk, you are in luck because, as the title of this episode indicates, he is going to be giving us a modified version of that talk today. Troy is passionate about getting reluctant readers, especially boys, into books, and he is also the co-host of the podcast Queer Rights Sessions. He is currently working on his first adult crime novel. Well, we have a lot to talk about. Welcome to the podcast, Troy.
Oh, thank you, Kemper. That was a lovely intro.
Okay, before we get into the teens of Agatha Christie, I'd love if you could begin by telling us all your Agatha Christie origin story. How did you first come to Christie? I'm really hoping that it involves finding Christie on the shelf of some vacation spot, like so many other Christie fans on this podcast, like maybe in the Outback or something. But I'll take whatever I can get. I'm going to at least, go out on a limb and venture to say that you were a child when you first read her, but you tell me, how did you first come to Christie?
Yeah, sure. You're halfway there. I was raised by my grandparents and they did not have any books at all. But I think when I was about 10, we had a relative come and stay for a few weeks and she left behind two books. The first one was The Lonely Lady by Harold Robbins, which I was way too young to read. And the other one was 450 from Paddington. And I think,
wow, that's
I think 450 from Paddington is so important to my Christie story, I guess, because that kind of opening scene, that, the trains converging, that's such a powerful hook. I mean, obviously quite iconic, but also I think it's the thing that really dragged me in. And so, yeah, I would have been about 10. I read that. I really liked it. And then a few weeks later, I was at a fete at a local school and there was a box of books there. And sitting on top, was a copy of Hickory Dickory Dock with that, that stunning, vibrant green Tom Adams cover. Mm-hmm. And so I bought that. So my first book was a Marple. My second book was a Poirot. And I think from there, I basically got hooked. And I guess you would have been at the David Morris presentation at the Agatha Christie Festival recently when he was talking about the origins of that cover, the Hickory Dickory Dock cover.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yes. So he was saying how it was actually based on Elizabeth Taylor. And so now that every time I look at it now, I just think, oh, wow, it was Elizabeth Taylor that I was drawn to. But anyway, so 450 from Paddington was my first one. Then Hickory Dickory Dock, which I know isn't necessarily everyone's favorite, but I thought it was quite fun. And beyond that, my next door neighbor worked at a thrift shop, had discovered somehow that I liked one of these books, I don't know which, and brought me a whole box of those 70s Fontana Tom Adams covers. And so, yeah, that was it. I was done from there on in.
Yeah, it was pretty great at the festival when David Morris brought up the Hickory Dickory Dock cover and then told us all that that was actually Elizabeth Taylor. You could immediately see it. You're like, oh, of course it's Elizabeth Taylor, but it's not obviously Elizabeth Taylor somehow, even though she seems like someone who is unmistakable. But then once you see it, you can never unsee it. And of course,
you can't unsee it.
Yeah, like it's going to be her from here on out. But it's extra amusing because Elizabeth Taylor, of course, played Marina Gregg in that famous or perhaps infamous adaptation of The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side with that frozen look. And it's not quite the same look. And I mean, she's done up in a very different way, but it's just, two iconic Elizabeth Taylor close-ups that two very different for a Poirot and a Marple. So
yes, absolutely.
Yes, Elizabeth Taylor, the tie that binds.
As always, as she should.
As she should. And just future Kemper here, as I am editing this episode, I have included a post on the podcast's Instagram account at All About Agatha, which showcases the original Elizabeth Taylor photograph and then the Tom Adams cover that he drew from that photograph for Hickory Dickory Dock, as well as Elizabeth Taylor's frozen look from The Mirror Cracked, because we could all use a little bit more Elizabeth Taylor in our lives. So that's at All About Agatha on Instagram. Check it out. Okay, back to the interview. So I happen to know, because you told me, that Gus and the Missing Boy was originally going to be an adult mystery. It was a psychological thriller, but eventually you turned it into the award-winning YA mystery novel that it is today. I would love if you could just explain to us all how that happened, and in explaining, also tell us a little bit about the book itself, because I'm wondering if you could speak to the differences, if you feel that there are significant differences between adult mysteries and YA mysteries, especially since there's so much overlap between the two in terms of audiences. And that's something that I've been exploring in this multi-episode series on the YA mystery genre that I've been doing very, very slowly and inefficiently over the last year or so. But I would just love if you could speak to that.
Certainly. So to begin with, yes, it was much more of an adult psychological thriller. It was set in sort of two time periods, both contemporary but also set in the 80s, where frankly it was just much easier to kidnap someone back then. Between the fact that, obviously not just the lack of social media, but also things like police records weren't necessarily digitized, or they weren't necessarily available between different states, and even banking records, things like that, like automatic teller machines were just coming in. So it was set in the 80s because it was just a lot easier to do that sort of, kidnapping and just take someone kind of over the border and start a new life effectively. But anyway, so the book, that's what the book was. And I went to a speed pitching session, which was essentially a room full of different publishers accepting kind of oral pitches. And it was a very popular event. The room was packed. And so ultimately, I managed to somehow stand in the wrong queue. And so I found myself standing in the YA queue. And I only realized really close to actually speaking to the publisher. And so I had to reconfigure my pitch really, really quickly and turn it into a YA pitch. And she was interested. She gave me her card. She said, send me the full manuscript. And so then I had to go home and turn my book into a YA book. And so I did do that over the next few months. That involved a lot of changes, which we can get into. But ultimately, that publisher then left both that publishing house and publishing in general. And so I found myself with a YA book, a YA crime novel, and not quite sure what to do with it. But then I was lucky enough to get an agent, and one thing led to another. And there were a couple of publishers that weren't so keen on this YA version of the story. This was happening all during COVID. And I remember kind of thinking, what's missing from this story? What would make this story more appealing to publishers? And I'm kind of looking around my office, the bookcase full of Agatha Christie. I'm just like, I should go full Christie on this, like proper Nancy Drew, just make it a proper mystery rather than this sort of psychological thriller. And so that's what I did. So I rewrote it kind of top to tail. And then it went out and, I got picked up. So I was very lucky. And so Agatha is responsible for me being published.
I love that. I want to go full Agatha Christie.
Yeah.
That is fantastic. And getting in the wrong line, I mean, the happenstance of that is that's an outstanding story. I applaud you for your quick thinking. You just sort of were quick on your feet and were able to adapt your pitch, and then you had to go home and adapt the text.
Yeah, there's nothing like a sort of weird deadline like that to suddenly have to rewrite something entirely. And I will say, I think that the story itself rather, works better as a YA book than it ever did, a YA sort of crime book than it ever sort of did as a psychological thriller. I think the two different time periods and different voices and perspectives, I think they were complicating a story that became much simpler when it became a YA story, because I guess one of the main sort of tropes of YA stories is they tend to have first-person present tense narration. Mm-hmm. And so that makes the stories very immediate. And I think it just made it a lot easier to pull together. But because it is harder to kidnap people now, I did have a police detective that I would talk to and sort of say, if I did that, how would that happen? And if they did this, how do you find the records for that? It's like, if you kidnap a child, how do you get them into a school? So yeah, lots of things like that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there is an immediacy to your first-person narrator that I think does have that YA feel, but that is not unlike a lot of the first-person narration that we see in traditional and even Golden Age mysteries, right? I mean, Hastings is not narrating in the present tense, nor is Watson ever, like that traditional viewpoint is definitely looking back, but like there is a real immediacy there. And I think it's, not too much of a leap that you have to make from that sort of, from that Golden Age literature to what's happening in a lot of YA, especially if you're doing a mystery. I mean, why do you think that there is so much crossover in both directions, right? You've got kids reading stuff like Agatha Christie, which was what we both did. And, almost everyone who appears on this podcast was not absolutely everyone, but most people were first exposed to Christie as children. And by the way, I love that you weren't on vacation, but someone else was when they came to visit you.
So half that sort of.
Yeah, we still have a holiday sort of aspect there to it. I love it. But why is it that so many kids, so many children read Christie and other mystery authors? And then also, why is it that so many mystery readers of adult mysteries and other adult fiction also read so much YA mystery? Like, I just think there's crossover in both directions to a particular degree. And it's just, I think, an interesting question to explore. And who better to explore it than one who has written YA mystery?
Look, I agree. I think there is a significant overlap. And to my mind, I think how it works is certainly certainly 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot less YA. And I think authors like Agatha Christie and Stephen King were the sort of first adult books that teenagers would pick up. I've always sort of jokingly called sort of Agatha Christie, the sort of gateway drug to adult crime. Mm-hmm. And I really think it's true. And there's a few reasons for it. I think that, both Agatha and Stephen King write really strong, compelling, but simple prose, that kind of skillful, deceptively simple. It's a camp old joke, but I remember Dolly Parton used to say, it costs a lot to look this cheap. And I think Agatha Christie and Stephen King spent a lot of time doing a lot of complex work to make their prose simple and readable and pointed and compelling. So,
that is a fantastic analogy to make. I love that you figured out a way to make a Dolly Parton analogy. I know that will make Mark Aldridge very happy. Huge Dolly fan. I'm sure there are other huge Dolly fans out there among not just the Agathologists, but all of the big Agatha fans. So that is fantastic. I know exactly what you mean. And I think you're absolutely right. I was actually speaking recently with Maureen Johnson, another YA author. We were just talking about how easily dismissed that clean, simple prose is. And her answer was like, well, then you do it. You do it if it's so easy. And it's like, you can't, because there's such skill involved. And I was also recently speaking with another mystery fan and writer on Patreon, actually, about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, because I think there's a similar thing going on with the Sherlock Holmes stories, because those two, and I really was reminded of it when I reread The Hound of the Baskervilles recently for a Patreon episode, and it had been a long time since I had read Sherlock Holmes. That prose too is very crisp and clear. There's a ton of dialogue. It is just a delight. It is like a knife through butter to read those books. And I think that you just cannot overstate the importance of that kind of writing. And Stephen King is another one. I mean, there is a reason that these people endure and they are as popular as they are.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. And I think that there's something, I also think Agatha's success as a playwright, part of that comes into it too. Her ability to really so economically but deeply and profoundly sketch characters, or you find out so much about characters within a few sentences. So I think it's a deeply underestimated skill.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
I also think there's an element with Christie, like she was so prolific and there's, her sales over many, many decades. I can also understand why she's so accessible. I feel like even if you walk into a household where there aren't necessarily many readers, if there's a bookshelf at all, there may well be a Christie or a Stephen King novel there. I think there's something about both of the, by the 70s and 80s had become a brand, like Christie very much for crime and Stephen King for horror. And even though they wrote beyond that, I felt like they were that brand. They were such a known quantity that I think that's why, they sold so many copies. That's why people would buy a copy if they were going on holiday and then leave it at that cottage or hotel. So even teenagers who haven't necessarily read much or are necessarily even interested in crime, I think everyone's kind of heard of Agatha Christie as a name, like as a brand. So, I think there's a few reasons for that. But I also think that going back the other way, there's a few sort of kind of tropes and things that YA writing gives you that I think appeals to adults. So I think when you look at, this doesn't apply to all, but when you look at young adult novels, as I said, they tend to have sort of first-person narrators. They tend to be in the present tense, so they feel very immediate. They tend to be fast-paced. They often, open up right in the middle of a scene or some action. They tend to have characters that are instantly recognizable, like really quickly you're into the story and who these characters are. And the characters themselves, because they're teenagers, they're kind of full of feelings and emotions, and they may not necessarily always have the language to articulate it well. But there's all of these different elements of YA stories or YA novels that I think really appeal to adults as well. Even things like having shorter chapters. I think short chapters is the key to why people stay up late at night reading books. Because if you know the chapters are only a few pages, you'll be like, I'll just read one more and I'll just read one more. And suddenly, it's 3 a.m. So I think for all of those reasons, there's a real appeal for adults with YA books. But I think the other thing, like I have a lot of discussions with authors about the difference between not necessarily crime, but YA versus adult books. And I feel like I don't think they're terribly different. And I don't think writing for these audiences are very different. I think a good story is a good story. And I think writing prose is writing prose. But I think there are some elements of YA books that there are some things you need to consider when writing for a younger audience. And so obviously I think it's really important that you can absolutely cover dark or complex topics. And I do that in my books, but I also include trigger warnings up front with corresponding page numbers. So, if there's topics around self-harm or kidnap, obviously, or drug use or whatever, at least that's there up front. Like I don't believe in dumbing down concepts for teenage readers, but I also don't think you necessarily need to dwell on it. So, in my second book, Gus and the Burning Stones, there's a dead body, but you don't see how that person dies. So, murders and violence can sort of happen off the page a bit. And so I think that is useful. You're not necessarily avoiding what's happening. You're not pretending it's not happening, but you just, things are happening on another page in another space. And I think that means that you can talk about dark, complex things with teenagers, but you're not being gruesome for the sake of it. You're not really sort of dwelling on it. And I think those elements, plus with YA, I should add, there tends to be a sense of if someone's doing something or behaving in a particular way, that you need to show consequences. And so, again, there tends to be, that is an important element, I think, of writing for YA audiences. But also when it comes to YA crime and crime in general, I think there's a lot of appeal for the sense that, there's the world and then something awful happens, stuff happens, there's an investigation, et cetera, but justice is seen to be done in some form by the end. And so that is very much a YA thing. And I think that's why adults also like YA books, because they get all of the great stuff from adult crime novels, for instance, but perhaps less gore, less sex and swearing, less drug abuse, I suppose.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, you identified two major elements, I think, of what people often say about Christie, which is that the violence is not necessarily blood spattered and over the top gory, at least on the page. Even if it's alluded to, it's not necessarily depicted. Sometimes it is. So there's that. And then also the idea of consequences, right? And, even though Christie is not afraid of going extrajudicial or being complicated or complex about how justice is served, usually by the end of her books, you do get a sense that justice has been served and like that there actually have been consequences. So that's really, I never thought about it that way, that, those are almost like two tenets of YA that has a sort of darker tone to it, that, we don't go too crazy with the gore. We also make sure that there are consequences. And I think that's kind of intrinsic. Christie certainly wasn't, worried about either of those aspects. She didn't care, I think about what the effect was going to be on her readers. That's just the way that she wrote her stories. And I'm going to do a future episode actually on whether or not Christie is cozy, which is such a
That'll be interesting.
Yes, it's such a tortured question because, first we have to define, well, what do we even mean by cozy? And that's probably going to be a good half of the episode. But, I think there's something to be said about that quote unquote cozy aspect of so many of her books as to the lack of, physical depictions of violence in particular. as well as the consequences for the evil things that people do. So more to come on that front, but I love that answer. I mean, I think that's really, really fascinating. And clearly there's just a lot going on as to YA in general these days, which has become such a marketing phenomenon. And I agree with you. I think there's just so much material that 30, 40, 50 years ago would have been shunted into the YA category because YA sells, right? Because it sells so well now, but it just didn't really exist as a possible marketing stream back then. And of course, I've said this before on the podcast, but the classic example is To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird 100% is a YA novel.
Absolutely.
It's got a child protagonist. It also happens to be one of the classic works of American literature, like full stop, So 100%, I don't think that, the YA label has to be limiting or siloing in any way. I think what it really means is that the protagonist is probably younger than in adult fiction, probably younger. It's not even necessarily the case, but probably the protagonist is younger. And often, there will be a first person narration. There might be more of, a tendency to do present tense as opposed to past tense. But of course, there's plenty of YA that's written in past tense as well. So yeah, there's a lot of range there, right?
I also think that from various discussions I've had that YA crime is very much seen as cozy crime for exactly that reason, that you can read it, like whether you're a younger reader or an adult, you can read it knowing that it's almost like a rating for a TV show or something. You can read them knowing that you're not going to be assaulted by visceral violence. And that there will probably be a sort of resolution of sorts, or justice will be seen to be done. Plus, you've got the lovely added bonus that so many of, YA crime and obviously Christie, you have the added bonus, the fun of the puzzle. And so it means that you can, in a way, I guess, relax back in your chair or wherever and just enjoy. It is quite cozy, I guess, to just sit back, know that you're going to read this story that'll be interesting and page-turning and immediate, all of those sorts of things. There'll be a fun puzzle to solve. You'll get to feel really clever and smug if you work it out before the last page. And at the end, the world will be set to rights. So there's a lot to be said for that concept of cozy, but I think it'd be fascinating to unpick that more.
Yeah. And I mean, there's been such a proliferation of cozy mysteries, right? I mean, I think that has become such a big subgenre, and it wouldn't be surprising if there was a major crossover between readers who are interested in cozy mystery and who also read YA mystery, because those readers tend to read a ton of mystery also, volume is never an issue. So yeah, that's really interesting. Well, fascinating stuff. I would just love, and you mentioned that when you were turning your novel into a YA mystery, you went full Agatha Christie. Could you give us just a little bit of a sense of which Agatha Christie novels you drew on, and also just what the kind of establishing concept, I obviously don't want you to spoil anything, but what the establishing concept of your first book is?
I can talk about my first book, but I don't want to say too much about which Christie novel inspired it, because it may give things away.
Fair enough.
I guess that the first book is called Gus and the Missing Boy, and it's about a 15-year-old boy who's really into true crime. He wants to be a police detective one day, but he does sort of feel out of place in the world. He's fat, he's gay, he's sort of stuck at home looking after his mum who's got health issues. Then one day, Gus finds a missing persons website with this digitally aged picture of a missing boy, and the picture eerily looks like him. So it makes him wonder, could he actually be a kidnapping victim, or, could his mum actually be his kidnapper? And so Gus and his friends, Shell and Kane, drive to the town where the kidnap took place, start to interview people who were suspects in the original investigation, and that includes the original detective. But yeah, then it all they start to get some answers, they get more questions, and all starts to unravel. And Gus starts to really struggle with his own identity and who is he? Where's all of this going? So I like to think that it's a pretty cool kind of concept to draw you in. And predominantly the second half of the novel takes place in a country town where the original kidnap happened. And there's sort of essentially 5 characters. So it's very much that kind of closed circle mystery. So these are all people that are involved in the original investigation. And so, yeah, it feels, particularly the second half is where I feel like I went full Christie in the sense that you've got a bunch of people, they all had, they were all suspects back in the day for the original kidnap. They all had motives. They all could have done it. They're all kind of lying about something, or again, it's all secrets and lies. And so all of those sorts of things, those red herrings have to be unpicked. And then, yeah, ultimately the resolution happens. And yes, and hopefully that's a satisfying one for readers. So I think you could kind of categorize, there's quite a few Christies that are a bit like that.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a fantastic establishing concept. I think it's a great hook. And, Christie often had just fantastic hooks to draw her readers in. So many of those openings. I agree, 450 from Paddington is just one of the best. Mrs. McGillicuddy, just watching from the window.
Yeah.
It's scary. It's intriguing. You have almost like the mathematical puzzle then.
Yeah.
Of like, where would this train have gone, and like where could it be, and like at what point did they meet, and it's so good. So yeah, no, I can see a ton of Christie in there. And obviously you had to wade into the world of teenagers while you were writing that. So not surprising that you would have some opinions and, a bit more knowledge than the usual layperson as to the teenagers of Agatha Christie. I'm so glad that you chose to do this for your talk at the most recent Agatha Christie Festival. And I want everyone to note the specificity of this topic. It is the teens of Agatha Christie, not the children of Agatha Christie. So, I think I kind of know the answer to this, but I'm curious why you chose to focus on teenagers in Christie's fiction as opposed to children. And I'd also just love to hear, before we get into the teens themselves, how you figured out which teens you would focus on, since there's so much material in Christie. She wrote 66 full-length mystery novels, a ton of short stories, plays, etc. You obviously could have done a lot more than the 10 that you focused on. So I'm just curious how you whittled things down and what the preparation process was for your talk.
Absolutely. So I guess beginning at the beginning, the idea of focusing on teenagers was essentially, I'm a young adult author. It felt like a topic that I was not uniquely, but I was fairly qualified to talk about. I also, the International Agatha Christie Festival, it's something I always wanted to go to, and I love the idea of being able to present to it. And what I did find was I was thinking, now that I'm a published author, and because there's such a sort of Christie vibe to the books that I've written, I was thinking maybe I could do this. And so when I was thinking about different topics, like when you go through Kemper, more than most, like it seems like you never run out of things to talk about. You never run out of different angles for Christie, but Christie teenage characters was one I hadn't seen anywhere. And so I thought that's why I wanted to focus on the teenagers. I feel like the younger the children are in books, the less kind of agency they have. So again, obviously there's lots of different children portrayed in Christie across all of those 66 novels. But I thought by narrowing it down to teenagers, that would be more interesting. And I guess how I looked at this was ultimately there were sort of 2 angles to it, really. Part of it was when I was coming up with this top 10, part of it was just how important were these characters to the plot? How much agency did they have? Because in some books, there are kids or teenagers, but they don't necessarily do much. They might be in the background. They may be contributing to clues, but they don't necessarily have a lot of agency, and they aren't necessarily that important to the plot. And so I started to look at it like that. But the other thing that I wanted to look at was seeing if I could draw a line between how Christie had portrayed some of these teenage characters and looking at what we know about her own life as a teenager. And indeed, as I got deeper into it, I also started to think, well, with a couple of characters, I was thinking, not that much connection perhaps between what we know of Agatha Christie as a teenager, but maybe a little bit more connection to Rosalind, her daughter. So I think that was those two sort of angles, like how much agency did the characters have and their relationship to Christie herself. Those two things kind of came together with this idea of let's focus on the teenage characters because I think they're more interesting. So they all came together like that.
Yeah, that's a great way of whittling it down. I think that is a principled trawling through the canon. And as one who has trawled through the canon with various sort of lenses or investigative angles, I think I can judge fairly well. So I love that. I love that you're bringing together a couple of different elements to the sort of their agency within the text, but also their relation to Christie and or Rosalind. It's really, really interesting. Well, let's just get into it. I would love if you could go through your list of teens, and I believe you're sort of doing this in rank order. You're at least kind of coming, I think you end with a bang, because I did get a little preview of your presentation, even though I unfortunately was not able to watch the presentation at the festival. I had to leave before Troy's presentation, and I was devastated, almost as devastated as Troy himself was.
Totally devastated.
But I knew that we were going to have this little coda, so I'm so glad that we can share this presentation with all the listeners out there, but also just with me, selfishly, because I can't wait to hear it. So could you take us through the teens of Agatha Christie, Troy?
I absolutely can. One thing I did want to say up front, when we talk about young adult fiction, or at least young adult as a concept, certainly in Australia, that tends to be from about the age of 12 up to around 18. And so what I did do with this, for reasons, is kind of basically went 12 right up to about 19. It's slightly a stretch about what, technically maybe a teenager is, but it broadened the range of characters that I could look at. And so that was important.
I can't possibly think of a 12-year-old who you might want to include on this list. Just can't even imagine who that
Can't even imagine. Absolutely not. The other thing I would say is I did stick to the 66 novels because I feel like both that was quite enough to go through. But also, given the audience, I did think that I've always sort of felt that people are far more familiar with the novels than many of the plays or some of the short stories. And so that felt like the right thing to do. But even that, going through them, I think there is sort of one character I kind of left out. So we'll get there when we get there.
Okay, and this is an invitation then to listeners. If there are any listeners out there who think that you forgot anyone or left out anyone who you shouldn't have from the short stories or the plays, email me and I will be sure to pass that along to Troy. I know that he would be thrilled to hear from you. I actually really do mean that, because I love the listener input that I tend to get when I do those themed episodes. So I would love if we got some input for this one as well.
Yeah, I would love to hear. Someone did call out one character in the presentation, and rightly so too. But I'd be very interested if there's others that I've missed. Like, there may be reasons, so maybe I didn't miss them. I just chose not to include them.
Okay. Oh, so you're gonna tell us who that character is that got called out during the presentation?
Yes, I'll get there.
Okay. All right. I'll stop talking now. I'll let you do your thing.
All right, then. I did say as part of this presentation that, this lovely podcast has taught us that Christie readers do love a ranking, a listing. And so that's why this has sort of effectively become the top 10 teen characters in Agatha Christie novels. So starting at number 10, I had Ruby Keene. So Ruby Keene is from the Marple novel, The Body in the Library. Ruby's 18, platinum blonde hair, flashy, cheaply glamorous, and she's a young dancer at the Majestic Hotel. And she's not necessarily the main character in The Body of the Library, but she is the body in The Body in the Library, although maybe not. So trying to avoid spoilers.
Well, and Troy and I were talking about this beforehand, and I said, if you spoil anything, Troy, I will give a spoiler warning at the beginning of the episode, because I often feel like to have a substantive conversation, we have to spoil things every now and then. But I will just say this. I love that you have included Ruby Keene as a teenager, because I do not think of her as a teenager. And I think that is going to be a running theme of a lot of the people who you have on this list. And that is not a criticism. That is actually a compliment, because I think it's really important to note that characters like Ruby Keene are teenagers. The teenager that gets all the attention is Pamela Reeves, right? From the actual Body in the Library. Spoiler.
Yes.
But Ruby is also a teenager. And I think she is presented and portrayed in such a way that she is this fast dancer who is, kind of taking up with this rich family. And there's a lot of judgment from some of the characters that doesn't necessarily have to be Christie's judgment, but there is some judgment, I think, that affects just the memory of who she is. And I think it's important to remember that this is a vulnerable teenager, right? Who gets caught up in all of this. So I think that is a fabulous number 10 on the list.
Yeah, and I think I really wanted to include her because I find it really interesting the way that she's portrayed in the book. You've got Dolly Bantry barely talks about her like she's a person. She's kind of secretly thrilled that there's a dead body in the house, and it's all very exciting. And Colonel Bantry's kind of annoyed that there's a dead body in his library, and, the police are they're kind of talking to the Colonel as if, sort of eyebrows raised, what's he been up to? And they are almost positioning Ruby as, a prostitute that's been found. So it's not very respectful. And even Miss Marple's a bit snarky about it when she talks about class. So I found that really, really interesting. And it's really only Conway Jefferson, he's this rich, enigmatic man, and he liked her and valued her and said, mate, she's not a lady perhaps, but thank God neither vulgar nor abominable. With education and polishing, Ruby Keene could have taken her place anywhere. And I love that he saw that in her, and it wasn't a kind of creepy thing. He saw value in her where it feels like no one else did. And so I think Ruby Keene and Pamela Reeves are very interesting because, we were just talking about cozy crime, but the way they're killed, it's awful. And I think that they suffer this terrible fate. And there's something I kept thinking, there's this weird connection between a non-empathetic treatment of them and the fact that they're working class. So as I went through these books and these characters, it feels like working class girls in these stories are quite dismissed. Whereas if you are sort of more middle or upper class, then it's more of a tragedy if you're murdered or you're taken more seriously. So I do find that that's quite interesting, and it sort of shows itself in a few other books as well. I mean, people like Marlene Tucker in Dead Man's Folly, it's the same sort of thing. It's like the way these girls are treated is really quite distressing. But anyway, how I did the ranking, Kemper, in the presentation was that if they were really important to the plot, I would give them a ranking out of 3 keys. And if they were really important or there was a relationship between the character and some of the things that we may know about Agatha's younger life, I would attribute them a score of 1 out of 3 typewriters. So going back to Ruby Keene, I've given Ruby 1 key because she's quite important to the plot, but she's also dead, so she doesn't have a lot of agency, so only 1 key. and no typewriters, because I didn't really see any relationship to Ruby and Agatha's own life.
I love that you have some sort of a ranking system in place here, which with little visual signifiers, which I'm sure was very fun at the festival as you were doing your presentation. And again, I think Ruby is a fantastic way to start this list. So let's talk about number 9.
Okay, at number 9, I had Victoria Johnson from A Caribbean Mystery. So Victoria is a native of the island of St. Honoré, and she works at the Golden Palm Hotel. Contextually, she seems like she's about 18 or 19. And I think that I should point out, with these characters, often their age isn't specified in the novel. So when it isn't, I suppose I've kind of looked at context, the way people treat them, or like non-fiction reference books trying to pull this together. So Victoria is a good example of this. Her age isn't really stated, or at least that I could find, but everyone talks about the fact that she's really young, she's really, really inexperienced, despite the fact that she actually seems to have a common law husband and children, and young children. So I wanted to include Victoria for a couple of reasons. One, because she is another sort of lower class character, and I find it really interesting how they're portrayed. But I also think that she's a really strong character, and because she's a person of colour, and combining this with her job and her status, it means that she's underestimated by, some of the characters in the novel. And really, Victoria's quite smart. She's very observant. She sees something, realises it's important, and, so that makes her quite an interesting character with a bit of agency. Unfortunately, she also decides to try and blackmail someone, which doesn't work out so well.
Does not go very well for...
No.
Yeah.
But yeah, because she is a person of colour, she does, she helps Miss Marple solve the first murder. She does have agency, so I gave her 2 keys. I didn't see any great resemblance to Agatha herself, but I do feel like just being smart and observant meant that she was worth 1 typewriter. So there we go.
Yeah, I mean, here again, this is a character I definitely do not think of as a teenager when I am conceiving of her, but I think you are backing up your inclusion of her here with some, textual references, and I get it. I think it's just a different way of looking at this character, because the other thing is, when you, and the same really goes for Ruby Keene, who I'm still thinking about, when you say that someone is a teenager, what you immediately think to yourself is like, wow, they have so much life ahead of them. Yeah. Right. And these 2 characters, both of whom die in the course of the novels in which they appear, we don't necessarily dwell so much on what was lost. Right? Certainly not to the extent of a Carlotta Adams in Lord Edward Dies, which is just, for whatever reason, the one that really will just always sticks with me when Poirot is looking at her corpse and just lamenting, like, this poor, young woman who was so talented. And I think there it's like she had this talent, she was this actor who could just impersonate and just do the talent was pouring out of her, and that's all lost and it's all gone. But these are people who just had a ton of life ahead of them. And what Conway Jefferson says, really boils down to, she could have gone in so many different directions. She could have made something of herself.
Yeah, she had potential, and that potential was snuffed out.
Exactly. And Victoria too. I mean, this is someone who is at the beginning of their life. Like, she is she has young children. She's full of energy, curiosity, ambition. And unfortunately, those are all used against her. But just a really interesting way to think about these characters. So continue. Who do you have for number 8?
Number 8, I have Norma Restorick from Third Girl. Norma, I think, contextually is about 19 years old, and I do love the way that she sort of comes into the novel, sort of, visits Poirot and just sort of says, "Oh, I've committed a murder," but then she goes, "Oh, you're really old," and then runs off, which is terribly rude. But it does mean that Poirot has to engage Ariadne Oliver to help find her. So yeah, I do think that I think Norma's a really interesting character. And I think you have this situation in the novel where Agatha's really talking through Poirot when, the text says anyone of Poirot's age and generation would have only had one desire: to drop the girl into a bath as soon as possible. There were hundreds of girls looking exactly the same. They all looked dirty, and yet, in a contradiction of terms, this one had the look of having recently been drowned and pulled out of a river. And so, perhaps these girls weren't really dirty. They just took enormous care and pains to look so. So I do think that's really, really interesting because, third girls from the 60s. And I think that you can see, through Poirot's eyes that, perhaps Agatha's got thoughts about about the young women of the 60s. It's not necessarily a particularly flattering view, but it does sort of demonstrate that, she's paying attention to what's happening to the world around her. And, it's reflecting that. But what I also think is interesting about Norma is that, she's behaving quite erratically. Everyone thinks she's difficult and peculiar. It's not a very particularly complimentary portrayal. But ultimately, you do sort of find out that, she's being drugged and for plot reasons. And so it's not unreasonable that she would think she's actually maybe murdered someone. So she's a really interesting character. And she's interesting also because she's largely missing from the book. So she's kind of almost like part of the mystery herself. And so as a result, I feel like because she's both sympathetic and frustrating, but she does kind of incite the story in many ways. I think she should get 2 keys for her importance to the plot. But other than her class and maybe a combination of independence and vulnerability, I don't think she resembles Agatha much. So maybe just 1 typewriter. I did like that she does seem to end up in Australia, which I thought was pretty cool.
I mean, teenagers are often a mess, and boy, is Norma Restark a mess, right?
Yeah.
She's one messy teen. It's almost like the way that people rail about Gen Z reminds me of that passage about, not that people say that Gen Zers are necessarily dirty, but, just all of the kind of cross-generational back talk that happens, as to Gen Z from not even boomers so much as maybe Gen X.
Yeah.
It feels like that's what's going on there. And she definitely boomers Poirot when she's just sort of like, oh my God, you're so old. Like, I need to get out of here.
Too old. You can't do anything.
Really
You can't help me.
You're useless. You're useless. That's fantastic. Okay. Who do we have for number 7?
Number 7, I've got Miranda Butler. So Miranda Butler from Halloween Party. She's the daughter of Judith Butler, who's befriended Ariadne Oliver. So I was talking about class before. Miranda is sort of more middle, even maybe upper class. So her portrayal is quite interesting, I find. Certainly on some level, she's described as ethereal, delicate, fey, slightly otherworldly. And even Poirot says she's like a fragile creature. But she's also a bit of an enigma. So she's keeping secret. She seems to be operating in her own world. And she does have certain memories that are important to the plot. So what I find interesting about her is contextually, she seems to be 12 or 13, but she actually seems much older for her age. And I find this over and over as I'm going through that. And I think you've alluded to it too, Kemper. It's like you have this idea of there are some characters that seem very young, very teenagery, and then there are other characters who you may sort of remember as adults, but it turns out that, they were still technically teenagers. And so I think I found with Miranda, I was surprised how young she was when I sort of dug into it. So, yeah, I do find it's really interesting, the different portrayals. Miranda's portrayed quite mysteriously, again, for plot reasons. But I just think it's really interesting to contrast her as this sort of middle or upper class girl compared to Joyce Reynolds. So, Joyce Reynolds is, I think she's around 13, but she's working class. She tells a story about a murder that she says she witnessed, which kind of kicks off the whole thing. Yeah, and then she's like murdered brutally. And again, it's this same sort of thing. There's something about the fact that Joyce is actually working class. Like, her memory is treated quite poorly. The police are kind of dismissive. Even her mother seems strangely less upset than you might expect, let alone the fact, a little bit down the track, another of her children will cop it. And so there's this weird thing I kept noticing where, middle or upper class kids were being sort of treated within the text differently to working class kids. So I don't know, does being working class suddenly mean that you're less deserving of empathy? I don't know. It's an interesting observation. I don't have a great answer for it, but it's just something I noticed over and over.
That's really interesting. I had never really thought about the age difference between Miranda and Joyce, but right away when you said that Miranda was more like 12, 13, my immediate next thought was, oh, and Joyce is older. Like Joyce is a little bit older. Like I think that's absolutely true. And it's interesting that, she's the one who's killed it. Again, I'm just going to barrel through the spoilers.
The spoiler warning, please.
The secret that Joyce tells is, of course, not hers to tell, right? And that is what gets her killed. It's Miranda's, and Miranda holds on to it like the good, cultured girl she is.
Absolutely.
The good upper middle class girl. And I mean, I had recently been talking about Halloween Party, and I had said, the thing that people tend to say about it, which is, can you believe Mrs. Reynolds in that book and how she doesn't really seem to care that first one child and then two of her children have been killed? And I had a listener who's a scholar of Christie himself, contact me and say, if you actually go back to the text and look at the scenes in which Mrs. Reynolds appears, it's not that she doesn't care. It's more of, I think, an overarching sense you get from the book. And so, and it is true, because I said to myself, no, it must be something missing or wrong with Mrs. Reynolds. And it's not quite. She's upset. It's just that I think she barely appears in it. And Christie doesn't make a lot of her grief as a mother in a way that she sometimes chose to do with some of her other characters. But there is an overarching feel as to Joyce where everyone is just constantly criticizing her and just, denigrating her and her memory after she's been brutally killed, and saying, well, Joyce wasn't really all that great to begin with, and she was a troublemaker, and she always lied, and she was just kind of a pain. And, and we get something similar with Marlene, as you mentioned, in Dead Man's Folly. So tying that to class is really interesting, and I think there's definitely something there. As always, I think the question in these texts is, how much do we tie that to any sort of an authorial intention on Christie's part versus the world in which she was setting her books, and the way that the characters in these books deal with the loss of these working class characters in contrast to maybe some of the more middle class. Is that something that Christie herself was either consciously or subconsciously commenting on? It's possible. And I think it's really interesting that you found that contrast to be there in book after book after book when you were sort of focusing in on these teenaged characters. So I think that's just kind of food for thought and future food for future thought and future discussion, for sure.
I just on the subject of Joyce's mother, I do know what you mean. She doesn't get a lot of airtime. So it's not that she isn't upset, but it's just overarchingly, it feels like no one is, certainly not her brother, like no one is upset. And there is something upsetting, I find, as a reader, how dismissive everyone is of Joyce before she's killed. And so after it, it's like, it really is like, so, well, she was quite annoying, and, she was a liar and she was this and that. And so, I do find, I find that Halloween Party is an interesting one, because you do have these two girls not too dissimilar in age. Like I said, age is sometimes a little hard to be super exact on, but not too far apart in age, but far apart in class and just how they're treated differently.
Yeah.
And going back to the ranking, I guess with Miranda, I feel like both because her knowledge, the murders she's seen, and she also spends really lovely time with Poirot. So I gave her 2 keys. And because she's sort of quiet, intuitive, imaginative, I wondered if there might be an element of young Agatha at that age too. So I sort of gave her 1 typewriter as a ranking.
All right, fantastic. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Well, let's talk about number 6 now. This is rounding out our bottom half of the teams of Agatha Christie.
Yeah, so at number 6, I've got Iris Mull from Sparkling Cyanide. I find Iris a really interesting character. I think she's stated as 18, but because she's the younger sister of Rosemary Barton, who is obviously Rosemary's the person killed at the bizarre dinner party central to the book. I always think that I kind of forget about Iris Mull a little bit because the book is so much about Rosemary, but Iris is such an important character in it. And I think that maybe it's deliberate in the sense that Iris as a character was very much overlooked for her more attractive sister, Rosemary. So, there's various quotes in the novel where you can see that some people have kind of figured out that Rosemary was beautiful, but maybe Iris was smarter or a deeper thinker than Rosemary. And it's just interesting watching Iris as a character sort of step out of the shadow of her older sister once her sister's dead. And she sort of starts to take on this role almost of detective herself. And so, so I find her quite an interesting character. And she does, we've got lovely Colonel Race, one of the, beloved Colonel Race stories. So you've kind of got Iris and Colonel Race sort of working together a little bit to solve this crime. So I quite like Iris as a character. And like I said, I think she's a character that we kind of forget a little bit about. So, yeah.
What's really interesting? I happen to have seen 2 staged adaptations of the radio play Yellow Iris recently.
Oh, okay.
One of them I included on the podcast when I went to my friend Christopher Deal's production here in Southern California of that show when he did a Poirot double bill. He did Wasp's Nest and Yellow Iris. And then I went with Chris in England when we were at the Agatha Christie Festival. One night we went to a staging of 3 different radio plays of Christie's. And Yellow Iris is that really, strange one. It's this peculiar radio play that she wrote, and it had these song performances in the middle of the play because they're attending a sort of dinner theater. And of course, that was made very much for radio because there were these little musical interludes. But one thing I noted, since Yellow Iris really is the, proto version of Sparkling Cyanide, she changed many things about it when she adapted it. I don't even think it's really accurate to say that she adapted Yellow Iris into Sparkling Cyanide, but she used a lot of the setting and the bones of that, radio play / short story when she wrote Sparkling Cyanide. But the character of the woman who had died before the story begins. So the quote unquote older sister in Yellow Iris, her name is Iris. The sister's name is Pauline. And then when she did Sparkling Cyanide, she turned Iris into the little sister. And then, of course, Rosemary. And there's so much made in that novel about Rosemary is for remembrance.
Remembrance.
Yeah, and she really uses that. And then there's even the analogy made to when sort of Iris's suitor realizes that she is the one for him, he likens it to Romeo having been in love with Rosaline and then seeing Juliet, right? And so Rosaline and Rosemary also goes very well together. That's Anthony. Is it Anthony Brown? Is that who it is?
Yeah. Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So
Anthony Brown.
Okay, good. I won't have to cut that out, which I totally would have if that was wrong. But yeah, there's a very big, I think, interplay going on in terms of the relationship between those sisters. Like that ends up becoming central because I think what we realize when we get, to the end or even the middle of the novel is that Iris's impression of her big sister, like her teenaged, immature impression of who her big sister was, is not very accurate.
No.
Right? Rosemary was actually, let's be honest, a little bit more tawdry, maybe even trashy. It's horrible to say trashy, but she wasn't quite the golden goddess, the untouchable golden goddess that I think her little sister always took her for. And we're sort of figuring that out along with Iris. So it's like she grows up over the course of the novel and, falls in love and comes into her own, and the mystery gets solved. And how appropriate that she is a teenager while all that's happening. Though, once again, not a character that I ever would have really called a teenager before, but I think it makes perfect sense. So, really, really interesting perspective on Sparkling Cyanide.
I do agree. I think that there's something quite charming about watching her evolve as a character through this novel. And like I said, sort of step out from under Rosemary's shadow. And so, Iris ends up being, a key player in the novel. She's often our point of view person. And interestingly, she's, almost a victim as well. Like there's a couple of murder attempts on her. And I don't know about you, but when I'm reading a Christie novel and someone survives a couple of murder attempts, I tend to be very suspicious of them maybe being the killer themselves.
Sure.
So this is a curious one. So, for the fact that she's a key player and she survives and she's not a murderer, I gave her 2 keys. And because she's got sort of complex relationship with her older, potentially more attractive sister, and she doesn't necessarily love social activities, I felt like maybe there's enough of a hint of a younger Agatha in Iris. So I gave her 2 typewriters.
Yeah, let's never forget Agatha Miller was a younger sister, right? And she really looked up to her older sister, Madge, who had, to a certain extent, this, glamorous life as anyone who's 10 or 11 years older automatically would. But, the family was even wealthier when Madge was coming into her own, and she had this lavish coming out, within society in New York. And it was just very different. I mean, Agatha had to go to Egypt with her mother, and her father had passed away at that point, and the family was not
in different fortunes.
Not doing quite as well. But then Madge had married very well, and she had multiple estates, including Abney Hall, where the family would go for Christmases and other holidays. So, I think you can see some of that in the sister relationship there. All right, well, that's fantastic. I can't believe we're only at number 6. Let's move on here. But this is really fun. I'm really enjoying this. Tell me about number 5 on your list.
Okay, at number 5, I've got Linda Marshall from Evil Under the Sun. I love Linda. And I love that she's the stepdaughter of flamboyant actress Elena Marshall, who she just can't stand and wants to use voodoo and witchcraft and these other things to try and get rid of her stepmother. So to me, Linda very much feels like, even though I think Linda is 16, she feels younger and she feels very much like a teen character in a way that some of the other characters we've talked about haven't. In the book, Linda's described as awkward as a young colt and as prickly as a hedgehog, which I love. And then she has this sort of, she's left school, but she doesn't know what to do next. She doesn't know if she could, maybe she'll go to finishing school in Paris or et cetera, et cetera. So she's kind of stuck almost between being a child and an adult. And again, that's very much a sort of like young adult novel trope. But more importantly, I just love the interactions she has with Poirot, especially when she actually thinks she may have killed Elena. I love that. I think it's so much fun to read. And I also think my one problem with Evil Under the Sun is that even when I read it, I'm still thinking about the Ustinov movie. I can't not. Do you find that too, when one of those films is so imprinted on your brain that it sort of overrides your sort of later readings of books?
Oh, absolutely. And when you started talking about Linda, my brain went to the 1982 Evil Under the Sun starring Peter Ustinov, because there's that great scene where she's sort of summarily sent up to bed by Diana Rigg, and she just hates Diana Rigg so much, and it's kind of a brutal scene actually, where like she, her stepmother just has this power over her, and she is so resentful. And I do agree with you 100%. This is the character on your list where I'm like, oh yes, I think of Linda as a teenager. Definitely. Like, she is such a teenager. And I just have to also mention, I've mentioned this before, that we have another teenage character who actually does this voodoo thing in a play of Christie's. That play is Spider's Web.
Yes.
And the character there is 12 years old. It's Pippa, but she does the exact same thing with voodoo. And I just think it's funny that Christie went to that well again. I wrote Spider's Web after Evil Under the Sun.
I love the whole thing as a concept. But I do find Linda really, really interesting. Like, she does have a key role in the plot. Like I mentioned, she even sort of is kind of a suspect at one point. But I also find it interesting just the relationship she has with Elena, and almost like that sense of, as long as Elena's around and the way that she treats her, or the way that Linda thinks about Elena, I feel like that's keeping Linda as a child almost. And so something has to change, something has to give for Linda to develop into an adult. Yeah. And so for those reasons, I gave Linda 2 keys. And in terms of a young Agatha, I thought about how Linda and Agatha both loved reading. They knew the loss of a parent at that age. They were both smart and curious. I think they both sort of disliked glamour. And I think also because the book's in Devon, so, the connection's pretty strong. So I sort of said 2 typewriters for Linda.
I think that this is one of the few Christie books in which the frustration of a teenager is used as a significant red herring, right? I mean, I guess that's a slight spoiler. Linda didn't do it in Evil Under the Sun. We don't have to say who did, but it wasn't her. But it's legitimately used. And I think that's sort of the source of that scene that we get in Peter Ustinov, Evil Under the Sun, even though it doesn't exactly play out that way in the text. We have that sense of frustration, and she feels so thwarted. And she really hates her with that kind of fiery rage of a teenager, of someone who isn't fully cooked yet and doesn't really have the perspective to know that, you can, this is not going to last forever. She's really included among the cast of suspects for her teenagehood. I think that absolutely makes her a really significant teenager, and an excellent choice for the top half, the beginning of the top half of your list. So tell us about number 4.
Okay. For number 4, I have Elvira Blake from At Bertram's Hotel.
Ooh.
So I know At Bertram's Hotel is not everyone's favorite book, but I'm quite fond of it. I think perhaps more for the characters than the totality of the plot. But anywho, Elvira's 17, 18, wealthy heiress. She's kind of poised, a little cold, a bit cunning, but she has this really interesting sort of almost non-relationship with her mother, Bess Sedgwick, who was described as this famous adventuress, dabbling with the French resistance, flying solo across the Atlantic, driving fast cars. So, I mean, Bess is a great kind of visceral character and, abandoned Elvira as a baby. And, clearly Bess was busy and living a dangerous life. So, probably not the best person to be raising a child. But anyway, so Elvira, I just find really, really curious. I've always been sort of drawn to her because she's a bit enigmatic and she could come across as kind of cold and calculating, but she has this kind of Achilles heel, which is her mother, her famous mother, that everyone loves, but she barely knows. And she sort of seeks her approval or wants to know more about her, but there just seems to be this kind of, big chasm between them. Yeah, and there's at one point, Colonel Luskin, her guardian, sort of says to her, it's not always a happy thing to have a wonderful person for a mother, which I think was really quite pointed. And so, yeah, I think Elvira's both, she's got a lot of agency, she steals, she takes risks, she heads off to Ireland to get some information, lying to the school, etc., etc. But she's also this vulnerable character, and she seems very much like a teenager when it comes to, I think, her inherent desire to get her mother's attention. And so, yeah, she's both kind of cunning but also sympathetic. And so that's what I think makes her a really enigmatic kind of teen character. There's a sort of sense of almost like tragedy, sort of beneath the veneer that she sort of portrays outwardly.
I think Elvira is horrifying. but I mean that as a compliment. I mean, I think she's earned her place on this list by being such a horror show. If Norma Restorik is Christie's affectionate portrayal of a messy teen, I think that Elvira Blake is her depiction of teenaged evil. It's like young, unformed evil, or just kind of amorality, because she, and again, I'm just going to spoil the hell out of this one too, but Elvira Blake did it, right? I mean, Elvira Blake is the murderer at the heart of At Bertram's Hotel, to the extent that At Bertram's Hotel is a mystery, because it's kind of a thriller. But what's so interesting is we've seen her have this Achilles heel of her mother, but what we realize at the end is that Bess Sedgwick is willing to sacrifice, right?
Yes.
For her daughter, even though she has never been there for her before. So in a way, it has this little sentimental ending tacked onto it. I'm not certain whether or not it's a convincing little sentimental coda to what came before, but I see what at least Christie is trying to do there, or what I believe Christie is trying to do there. And I do think it's interesting when we're thinking about the relationship between a teenager and her mother. And, I have a feeling you're also going to go to the fact that Christie at that point in her life was someone who had raised a teenaged daughter, right? I mean, Rosalind was well fully grown at that point, but I have to imagine that perhaps the thought crossed her mind, at least, that, this could in some way relate to her own relationship. Or I have to imagine that at least subconsciously she was drawing on something there. As horrified as she probably would be to hear me say that.
No, look, I do agree. I think I like Elvira more than other people. I do think of her more as kind of amoral than evil. And I do think that she's, I don't know, she's almost like, perhaps she's a product of, of her sort of cold upbringing or her distant relationship. And so certainly in terms of the plot, Elvira is very central. She had a lot of agency. She's very ruthless. She's a murderer. So I did award her 3 keys. And looking at Agatha's own life, I did sort of think, I wondered, but looking at Agatha's own life, I didn't necessarily see a relationship to Agatha herself, but I did wonder if this was a sort of a version of Rosalind. So if you took away the ruthlessness, the cunning, the murdering, what I think you are left with is an independent, self-reliant child, one that had, grown up with a famous mother, one that perhaps was seeking attention from that famous mother, attention that she didn't necessarily always get. So I do sort of feel that the relationship is there. And you're absolutely right. Like, this book is, what is it? It's 1965. So yeah, Agatha is Rosalind's, definitely an adult by now. And so Agatha has gone through that whole sort of process of raising a teenager.
I mean, she had a fully grown grandson at that point.
Yeah, actually.
Her grandson was 22.
You're right.
So,
oh, God, you're right. Yes.
Yeah. I think at the very least that the portrayal of Elvira Blake is powerful. And I don't know if I mentioned this when Catherine and I covered the book, but it puts me in mind of this fairly recent novel, The Girls by Emma Cline, which was her spin on the Manson family. And just that, to a certain extent, I think Elvira is also a product of her time, which is the 1960s, and perhaps Christie's sense that morals were falling apart a little bit. In decline, and some of these people had lost their way, and that too is a generational thing. So I think she's a fantastic choice for number 4. And we're now getting into what I like to call our medalists here, our top 3 spots. So I have to know who wins the bronze medal for Teenager of Agatha Christie.
Okay, for the bronze, I've got Angela Warren. So I'm very aware that Five Little Pigs is the number 1 novel for the podcast. And indeed, it is my favourite Christie as well. And so there couldn't be a list without Angela. Angela is actually really around 29, I think, at the time of the novel. But because nearly all of the action takes place in the past, in the summer that Angela was 15. So I wanted to include her, because how could you not? And I just think one of the really sort of, compelling elements of Five Little Pigs is just the beautiful, deep, rich characterization. And because Angela is one of those 5 little pigs, one of those suspects, I think she's drawn so beautifully. Everything from the sort of tomboyish energy, the way she kind of fights Carolyn for her attention if she finds Carolyn's giving too much attention to Amyas. She likes playing pranks on him. That's important to the plot. But also, I think Angela becomes a richer character when you sort of understand the history of, her scarring, the fact that, Carolyn chucked a paperweight at her back in the day, permanently disfigured her, and what that means and how that plays out. And so what I do love is that it certainly, Angela is raised with love. Disfigurement never sort of holds her back. But you also have Carolyn very much forever trying to atone for this kind of awful thing that she did when she was younger. So yeah, I think Angela's a fascinating character. And because you get to see her through the eyes of Carolyn, but you also get to see her through the eyes of her governess, Miss Williams. And so I just think she's so well drawn, because she is like a misbehaving teenager, but she's also, I don't know, she's smart and she's vibrant and she's energetic. And then it's also very interesting when you see her as an adult and, she's successful. She's a well-known archaeologist and she's really smart and not sentimental about the past. She fundamentally believes that Carolyn did not kill Amyas. And not because she's got great evidence, just because she has an intimate knowledge of Carolyn's character and absolutely knows she can't do it. So Angela, like I think all of the 5 little pigs in that novel, just really, really jumps off the page.
Yeah, in some ways, 5 Little Pigs is centered on the notion of teenaged impulse control or lack thereof, right? Because Caroline Crail, when she was 19, right, when she was a teenager, disfigured her little sister, not realizing what this outburst of temper would do. And I remember when I reread the book for the podcast, being surprised by how old she was, actually, but she still is a teenager when that happened. To me, that felt like the petulant act of a younger teenager or even a younger child, quite honestly. But I think
agree.
But I think Christie chose that age carefully because it shows that she did, to a certain extent, know what she was doing, and even more importantly, once it happened, she felt the full guilt that I think an adult would feel of, oh my God, what have I done? And it really changed her life, and it certainly changed her relationship to her little sister. Again, it's about sisters. And I think that guilt that she feels from, having done this as a teenager is absolutely what makes her so afraid that her little sister has the same impulse control issues, right? And that she actually did something really terrible to Amyas Crail. And of course, that's the whole reason that Caroline, that's without that, the House of Cards falls, right? And I don't have to spoil this one, because if you haven't read Five Little Pigs, just read it and you'll know what I'm talking about. It's so good. But really, the plot hinges on that belief of Caroline's about her teenaged little sister. So that's a really interesting way, I think, to look at the book. And I mean, I love the character of Angela Warren. She's one of my very favorites in the whole canon. I'm honestly, my only quibble is that I'm not sure she deserves the bronze. I think she at least deserves the silver, because I'm pretty sure I know who has the gold. But who is the silver medalist here, Troy? Who do you dare to have put ahead of Angela Warren?
I might just mention, with Angela, I've awarded her 3 keys to reflect the fact that she is a key character in the novel. She's one of the 5 suspects, but her role in the story is absolutely pivotal. Her character is so strong and authentic that she's one of those characters that I find just lives on long after you've closed the pages of the book. In terms of Agatha's life, Angela becomes an archaeologist as an adult, and Agatha married one. Both have strong feelings towards their older sisters. I think that the relationship between the 2 sisters is so important, particularly with Agatha and Madge, because if there wasn't that sort of almost like competitive element to them, then, Agatha probably would never have started writing. So, we owe Madge a lot. And so I feel like there's elements of that reflected here. So in that regard, I'm giving Angela 2 typewriters.
Love it. All wonderful reasons for why Angela Warren should be your second, if not top, teen. So who beats Angela Warren? He asked very sternly.
Well, will we come to blows? So at number 2, I've got Julia Upjohn from Cat Among the Pigeons. So I love Julia. And she's really only 13 or 14 at the time we're sort of introduced to her at Meadowbank School for girls. What I love is that, there's a murder, there's a jewelry robbery. And so, she seeks out Poirot herself and asks him to work on the case. So I love that, she's kind of got this agency at such a young age. She's also really smart. She figures out what's going on with the tennis rackets, different things. She's aware of things around her. I think she kind of puts a chair under the door handle to keep herself safe in her room. So, she's not like a naive child, but she is a child. And I think she's such an important character to the novel. She's such a focal point until Poirot actually comes in, which is, quite late. I think it's in the last third of the novel. So she's very important before then. And so there's something about, maybe it's the school setting too. Like a lot of YA novels are set in or adjacent to high school for obvious reason. And so maybe the school element helps, but she feels like such a strong kind of teenage character to me because she's got all of the agency. She's got this wonderful, charming, almost Nancy Drew-ness that she has with Poirot. But, she makes things happen. She is really clever. She's figuring things out. But I think the other thing that I really liked about her is that, in contrast to maybe some of the other characters, she's got this sort of great loving relationship with her mother. And her mother seems, in some ways it feels like maybe Julia is a bit smarter than her mother. I don't know. But I love how smart she is. I love how Poirot says, after they first meet, he goes, "I have formed a high opinion of your courage and your resource." I mean, hello, imagine if he said that about us. You'd be so thrilled.
Okay, fine. I can't be too mad at you. I would probably switch those two. I would probably put Angela Warren above Julia Upjohn, but I do think Julia Upjohn is an outstanding character, and not even just teenaged character. But if we're talking about teenagers, absolutely, she's one of the very best, and she's squarely a teenager in a book that is set at a girls' school among many teenagers. I also love how she's a counterpoint to Jennifer Sutcliffe.
Yes. Yeah.
And she's just she's got a good head on her shoulders. And I've talked about this so much on the podcast, but I do absolutely think that the relationship between Julia and her mother is Christie's sunniest spin on the relationship between herself and Rosalind, because Julia is independent and Julia's mother kind of does her own thing, and she travels a lot, and it's the opposite of like that possessive mother love that we see time and time again causing so many problems in the canon. I think that, this is in some ways her ideal mother-daughter relationship that we see depicted in the canon, and I like to think that there's a lot of her and Rosalind, especially if we're comparing poor Rosalind to Elvira Blake. Let's throw Rosalind a bone here and say that she's also Julia Upjohn.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so in terms of ranking, because Julia is so resourceful, brave, clever, and she's so important to the plot and literally brings Poirot into it, so I awarded her 3 keys. And indeed, looking at Agatha's life, both Agatha and Julia lost, their fathers when they were young. And I think both intelligent, self-possessed and resourceful. But while there are those elements, that relationship between Agatha and Julia, I agree wholeheartedly, Kemper. I think she's a beautiful gift of a portrayal of Rosalind. I think that this is Agatha. Yeah, maybe a sunny view is the best way to describe it. I think it's a beautiful depiction of how Agatha would like Rosalind to see how Agatha sees her, if that makes sense. I think it's a beautifully drawn relationship. And so as a result, I'm awarding 2 typewriters there.
Fantastic. I think that is well deserved, actually, the silver medal. So before we get to our gold medalist, by the way, you said you were going to mention the teenager that you hadn't included, who someone shouted out you should have. I had one that just occurred to me, although I'm not totally sure whether or not she's a teenager.
Well,
I know that I know that she is quite young. I'm thinking of Verity Hunt from Nemesis.
No, that's not the one. But do you want me to go to number 1 and then I'll mention it, because I actually think it's an oversight that I left her out. So
okay, I guess I'm just trying to draw the suspense out as long as possible. But let's get to our gold medalist, who is the best teenager, or at least most powerful teenager in all of Agatha Christie.
Well, yes, at number 1, we've got Josephine Leonidas. And how could it not be? I think one of the reasons I mentioned at the start, sort of trying to stretch that sense of a teenager from 12 to 19, is to make sure I could include her, because Josephine is incredible. She's, precocious, nosy, obsessed with detective stories, has a notebook full of secrets. I suspect I was a bit like her at that age, hopefully not as ugly, because she is described as a fantastically ugly child. But yeah, I think Josephine and her brother Eustace, to a degree as well, I find them really interesting portrayals. Josephine, what I love is that Josephine seems older, and then at times you sort of go, oh no, you are young. And so I love that sort of contradiction. And, obviously, I think anyone listening to this podcast probably knows that, Josephine is the murderer. And so I love the way that she sets up red herrings and near misses for herself. That almost feels quite meta in many ways. And I think that between the way that she's kind of sitting on the sidelines, observing things, that she's got an incredible presence without always being the focus. So that lovely sort of quiet spy on the sidelines that's watching. And, I think, there's a lot of there's something very satisfying, I think, sometimes when, the killer is almost like hidden in plain sight. And so I feel like she has that function as well. But more than anything else, I just think she's fascinating because she's kind of blunt and mysterious and quite evil. She's sort of smug, saying, "I've figured it out. I know who did it." And I think for certainly a chunk of the novel, certainly in the first reading, you fear for her because we've read Christie books. We know what happens when someone says, "I know who did it, but I won't tell you just yet." That's usually a death warrant. So I think she's fantastic like that. I just think she's so much fun to read. But I also think it's very brave of Christie to have a child killer, one this young and this unsympathetic.
Yeah, she's just brilliantly handled. I mean, she's such a seeming red herring, right? Because, a la Linda, right? From Linda Marshall from Evil Under the Sun. I talked about that teenaged frustration, the notion of feeling thwarted and not being able to realize that this too shall pass, right? Just not having a sense of the perspective that adults have when it comes to being upset about something. Because what is the real, motivation behind the murder of Josephine's grandfather is that he would not pay for her ballet
lessons.
That is it. And he was very nasty to her about it, right? Because he was like, "Why would I pay for your ballet lessons? You're garbage at ballet. Like, you're terrible." Yeah. And like, we get the sense, I'm sure she was. I'm sure she was doing that.
Totally. I'm sure she was. Absolutely.
I don't think she was exactly a twinkle toes out there up on the stage. But it's so brilliant of Christie, I think, to make her as young as she is, because that's believable, right? Like, if you have this sociopathic 12-year-old, like, that is what it would take. And I think if she was any older, if she was 16, 17, it would, I don't know, it would
diminish it.
It would diminish it. It wouldn't seem as believable, even if she was a sociopath. I think you would need to make the motivation a little bit more adult-like, and the childlike nature of what leads her to commit murder is what is so devastating and also convincing about the novel,
I absolutely agree, because her motive is so shocking and yet so completely reasonable in an undeveloped 12-year-old mind, 13-year-old mind.
Yeah. And this is why it really is why it's a little bit, I totally support you on including Josephine in this list. But it is a cheat because she's not really portrayed as a teenager. That's the whole point. The whole point is she's a child. Yeah. Like, she is on the cusp of becoming a teenager, but because she's a child, that is why she is stuck in this mindset of, well, if I want to have my ballet lessons paid for, I just have to kill a grandfather, you know? But close enough. It's too good not to include. And I think, it's obviously the infamous Christie in which the child did it. And and it's not just the red herring of, this is someone who seems very frustrated, so maybe she actually could have done it, but no, she would never go there. But it's also the notion that she's a child sleuth. She seems like the boys in 450 from Paddington.
Absolutely, she does.
Right? Or Dennis, who Leonard...
I was going to say Dennis.
Nephew, in Murder at the Vicarage. So we've seen so many of those characters before, and absolutely, I think our instinct as readers is to worry for her and, to think, oh no, is she going to be the next victim? And it really adds.
You totally do. You really do worry about her.
Yeah. No, it's just beautifully, beautifully handled. And, in terms of a depiction of a child, I mean, I don't think Christie ever did it better or used it to better effect than she did in that book. And it's why
Absolutely.
Cricket House is one of the top 10 ranked Christies on All About Agatha. So
Indeed it is. But there is something. I have always felt her character does seem older, and then she'll say something or do something and go, oh God, you're a child. And so I love the sort of that, in my mind, there's almost like this dichotomy of how she's portrayed. And as you say, I think we worry about her because we've seen this character before, and we know what happens to characters who claim to have figured it out but then don't say anything. And then we see, like a murder attempt, or what appears to be a murder attempt of her. So, yeah, I think Christie's kind of playing with our own expectations of how Christie novels play out with characters like this. But I feel like she's never done it this well, or this, almost like controversially. I don't know how many, other books of that era would have gone there and had this kind of malicious child murderer. The only other thing I would say about this is that I think that it's also interesting seeing her relationship with her, her nanny and her grandmother. I find that great aunt, sorry. I find that these sort of figures are figures that, Agatha had in her own life as well. So, I put her at the top. Obviously, Josephine is completely essential to the plot. Everything she does, everything she says relates to the murder. She's smart and cunning. She manipulates people, and I find her absolutely compelling. So that's why I gave her like the full 3 keys. But also,
how many typewriters are you giving her? How is she related to Agatha personally? I want to hear this.
So looking at Agatha's own childhood, I think there are quite a few aspects here if you take away the murdering stuff. So there's a sense of them both being clever, imaginative children, perhaps slightly lonely, despite the fact that they have a brother and a sister. They both like detective stories. Josephine loves ballet, Agatha loved opera, both had strong nanny figures. I also think, you've even got Josephine, not only is she reading detective books, but she's spending most of her time writing. So I felt like there's so much there that you kind of, take away the murder, you could relate to a younger Agatha. And so, I awarded 2.5 typewriters.
I know. I love that. Hey, and Agatha even, loved going to dance class. There's photos of her in dance class in the autobiography. And that's what's so devastating and effective about the characterization of Josephine. Christie was generally not one to identify with her murderers so much, even though she did manage to pull off somehow the threading of the needle of characterizing her murderers in an accurate way before she revealed them to be murderers, so that we didn't feel cheated by that. Like, usually we don't feel like, oh, you were holding back from telling us who this person really was. And yet she's not overly identifying with the murderer either, because that was just not what she was interested in doing. But Josephine, I think, is an exception because she's a child. Like, I think you can feel Christie's fascination with this character as murderer. And it's really true. If she didn't commit the murder, if she didn't go to the dark side, there's a lot to love about her, right? Like, she's actually, and I mean, they even say that in the novel, like, she's such a funny little kid.
Little goblin.
She's this like funny little goblin who just sort of, has her interests and her pursuits, and she just sort of like runs around and does her thing. And unfortunately, she has no internal moral code, but it's, I think you can feel that. And perhaps you could even go so far as to say that it's to some extent an identification. I mean, we do know that Christie would play alone a lot. I mean, her 2 older siblings were, I believe, 10 and 11 years older than she was. She
Definitely
was on
10,
her, she was on her own for much of her childhood. So she was left to her own devices, which is why she was able to, I think, hone the creative powers that she did, because she just thought up all these stories and she rose to the occasion, obviously. But that's interesting, I think, to think about Josephine and a young Agatha Miller. A little scary, but I really like that. No, I mean, what I love about this exercise, Troy, is that you're making me think about all these novels in a slightly different way or from a different angle. And that's the whole point of these sorts of thematic approaches to Christie. So I just think it's a fantastic exercise. I already heard that it was a smashing success at the festival itself, and I'm really glad that we were able to share it together between the two of us, but also with everyone else who's listening. I'm sure people really, really enjoyed that. And as I said, if there are teenagers who you think that Troy missed, who you would like to talk about, email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, and I will read that out in housekeeping. I will forward those emails to Troy as well. And this is a perfect segue into any other teenagers who you perhaps missed along the way, who you would just like to shout out right now, Troy.
Well, yes. So during or I think after my presentation, I did actually ask the room, do you agree with my list? Or, is there anyone that you feel should have been included that wasn't? And author Martha Jocelyn pointed out that I hadn't included Lettuce, or Lettice, apparently, Prothero from The Murder at Vicarage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was a bit surprised by this. In my mind, let's go with Lettuce because it sounds more fun. With Lettuce, she always seemed
Just
older.
Don't call her Romaine. That's my Agatha Christie dad joke of the day.
Tish, yeah. To my mind, she always seemed older. I think the fact that, she's posing for Lawrence in a bathing suit, the fact that she's driving around, and I just always felt that she was older. And in my defense, I never thought to consider her. And so I think when Martha mentioned that she was either just 16 or 18, I can't remember which, I was just genuinely surprised. And so what I had done as part of this whole thing is, I thought about all of the characters, and then I went through, like the ebook version of each book, and even did searches trying to confirm characters' ages and different things like that. But yeah, Lettuce was one that I didn't really consider. And so I was quite surprised when, Martha pointed her out. So I think she's one that I've left out.
Yeah, I was surprised that Lettuce and Dennis were as young as they were. I did not remember them as teenagers either.
No.
So you mentioned Martha Jocelyn, who I had on the podcast a number of episodes ago at the end of the summer of 2025, just before the festival. She also did a talk at the Golden Age Mysteries conference just before the festival on the children of Agatha Christie. And there definitely was some overlap with your presentation, but they weren't at the same events. So there was no stepping on toes, but I love the warring, and I'm using air quotes there, the warring YA authors and their juveniles of Agatha Christie talks. But yeah, and I was surprised because she mentioned Dennis and Lettuce in her talk, that they were really, some of the first teenagers that Christie depicted. So,
yeah.
And that's why, and I think, I have to really look back at the text. I'm not sure that Verity Hunt's age is ever really specified. But now that I think about it, I mean, she's kind of presented as a teenager. Like, she really is under the thumb Clotilde and her sisters, because they take her in, when her parents die. I believe they die in like a plane crash or something like that. So there's definitely a bit of a, the possessive mother love thing going on there. And I think you could probably make the argument that Verity Hunt is depicted as an older teenager who very much has her whole life ahead of her, and is getting involved with Michael Raphael fairly early on in her life, and they're engaged and they're going to be married. So, you could make the argument maybe she's in her 20s at that point, but she feels young. She feels young to me. Future Camper here. I just checked my notes for Nemesis, which I covered with Christie scholar Jamie Berntal Hooker. And according to my notes, Verity Hunt is 18 or 19. So I think definitely worthy of inclusion on this list as an older teenager. Back to the episode. But this is the great thing. I'm sure there's about 5 to 10 other people that we could be arguing about. And I will probably be able to tell you about some of them when listeners I'm baiting listeners now to write in about it, because I really do enjoy that. But enough for now on the teenagers of Agatha Christie. I have two final questions that I have to ask you.
Wonder what they are.
These are questions that I do my best to ask everyone who appears on this podcast. I don't always get there. Sometimes we run out of time. But first, and to be clear, this does not have to have anything to do with teenagers anymore. I have to ask you, what is your favorite Christie novel?
Well, as I did mention before, Five Little Pigs been my favorite for quite a while. But because I've already said that, I did want to also call out, I have this real thing for The Hollow. I absolutely love The Hollow, and I love the characters of Henrietta and Gerda. And I think there's something about, I don't know, this sort of mistress and her compassionate view of the wife. And obviously, you know, we could spend a whole other session perhaps talking about the relationships to some of those other kind of love triangles that have appeared in Christie over the years and their ultimate relationship to her own situation. But there's something about The Hollow that I've always really, really liked. So because Five Little Pigs is, I'd already mentioned it, I thought I'd give a shout out for The Hollow. And I did go and see a local production of The Hollow in Torquay when we were at the festival. And that was really interesting because I'd never seen the stage version before. And, you know, Poirot doesn't appear in it. And I think, you know, Christie famously said that she wished she'd left him out of The Hollow, which she's said about a few books, I think. And so, yeah, it was very, very interesting to watch that play as well and still see how important that sort of relationship between those two women was.
Absolutely. Yeah, I saw an off-Broadway version of The Hollow, which I also featured on the podcast. I did an interview with the director of that production, and it's a really interesting theatrical adaptation. And those are just two exquisite characters. I mean, the characterization in The Hollow is just some of her very finest, and that's why that book is also in our top 10. So I think that's a fantastic answer, and I'm glad that you were able to shout out a title other than Five Little Pigs, but only because you had already Five Little Pigs, just to be clear. And then finally, you knew this was coming, Troy, but I'm going to make you pick Poirot or Marple.
It's Marple for me. I think, you know, a 450 from Paddington was my first Christie, so, you know, you always remember your first. But as I mentioned earlier, I was raised by my grandparents, and sometimes I think I used to sort of draw a connection between my grandmother and Miss Marple, because if you just looked at them, you know, basically in appearance, they might just seem like benign older women. But yeah, my grandmother was really smart and kind of understood the darker side of the world, which I totally, as the years went on, I just kept thinking, yeah, there's a bit of Miss Marple in my grandmother and vice versa. So absolutely Marple for me.
Oh, I love that. I love that you have a really personal connection to Miss Marple.
Well, it's a very Marple thing to do, isn't it? Relate the character to someone else.
She reminds me of this person who I knew. Yeah. That's great. I love that. And that always makes me happy when someone makes the right choice instead of Marple.
Absolutely.
Well, Troy, this has been an absolute delight. I was really looking forward to this, and you did not disappoint. Just really, really fun talking about the teens of Agatha Christie and also about YA mystery. And I want to wish you luck as you continue to write. And, you know, in closing, I'd love if you could just give us a sense of what is next for you as a mystery writer. What are you working on?
Okay, so my second YA detective novel, Gus and the Burning Stones, only came out a few months ago. And so I'm currently doing promotion around that. But I've also been working on an adult novel for most of the year, sort of in the background. And so now that the YA novel's out in the world, this adult novel's taking center stage in my mind. And so it feels weird to say it, but I actually feel really excited about it. I think I've come up with a unique detective or a unique detective pairing. And I'm hoping that, I'm going to be able to create a really compelling, unusual, fascinating detective. And the story that I've come up with, again, I think is going to be really cool. Oh, this sounds arrogant to say. But yeah, I'm really excited about what I'm working on at the moment. So hopefully I'll get that book finished by the end of the year and start getting my agent to talk to publishers.
That's fantastic. And hey, being excited about what you're working on is not arrogance. That's just what you have to do to do the work of writing a book all on your own. That's really great. And I believe you were saying that, so Gus and the Missing Boy, and then its sequel of sorts, right? Gus and the Burning Stones, these two mysteries. So obviously they are both published in Australia. How about in other territories around the world?
Yes, I am. If there are any publishers or overseas agents that might be interested in some very twisty, Christie YA novels, then I'd love them to get in contact because, currently we haven't been able to secure a US or a UK deal. So, please come forward if, after listening to this, you're a little bit interested in finding out more about YA crime novels can be.
Take note, US publishers and UK publishers. I will include links to Troy's website and also to the book. I have to imagine that there are ebooks that are available for purchase given the magic of the internet at the very least. So this is something that is still available to everyone right now. But I think, it would be great to expand the reach of another great YA mystery series. And I wish you luck on the adult mystery that you are working on, and can't wait to see what happens next. And I will also include a link to the podcast that Troy appears on regularly. And I know that you're a regular listener of All About Agatha, so we'll just have to keep on listening to and reading each other.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this game. It's been an utter thrill.
Thank you again to YA author and Christie enthusiast and scholar Troy Hunter. I could have listened to the way that he says numbers in the teens all day, and I did. 13, 14. That was my very, very bad Aussie accent. I apologize to all of you out there in Australia. But it's always such a joy to do one of these themed episodes with a partner, especially when that partner really does all the work. I mean, that was Troy's presentation, so I was really just along for the ride with all of you, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. As I mentioned at the end of the episode, I have included links in the show notes to Troy's website, his podcast, and I encourage you all to check out everything that he is up to. For next week's episode, I am actually going to be discussing the denouements of Agatha Christie. I'm not ranking them or anything like that. I am reconsidering them. This episode is actually the product of an article that I was preparing recently to appear on Crime Reads, a daily newsletter that appears on the web, which I encourage mystery fans to check out because they really have a ton of excellent content, much of it created by mystery authors and other mystery scholars. It's one of my favorite daily emails to get. So I'm going to be talking about how Christie's denouements really function. All will be explained on the episode. If you are looking for more content in the meantime, you can always check out the podcast's Patreon account. I've included a link in the show notes. For June's Patreon, I covered 2 original short stories of Agatha Christie, 2 outlier short stories, The House of Dreams and The Lonely God. That episode is a nice little companion to the episode I did here on the regular podcast discussing The Edge, another outlier short story of Agatha Christie's. And for July's Patreon, I will be covering Mallowin's Memoirs. That's right, the memoir written by Max Mallowin, in which, of course, he talks at great length about Agatha Christie, or Lady Mallowin, as she became known later in life, Agatha Christie Mallowin. So that's an interesting angle on Agatha Christie. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And you can find me at my author website, www.kemperdonovan.com. Links to all of this in the show notes. And as I mentioned at the top of the episode, the 3rd book in my Ghostwriter Mysteries series is now officially out. Sweet Spot is available to purchase
wherever you purchase your books, so please go ahead and do so. I hope and trust that you will all enjoy it. And if you haven't yet done so, give the podcast a rating, give it a review. It helps other people find it. It means a lot to me. It's one of the many, many ways in which you all support me. And all of those ways are appreciated, each and every one of them. So thank you so much for that. And I'll see you next time. Bye.